Petra is one of those wonderful people who are formed and inspired by Dr. Sheila Carpendale, who really is one of the most amazing people within our fields. And her degree in computational visual analytics was also received from the University of Magdeburg in 2004. Okay, come on.
Oh, sure.
And as backup, I can tell you that her main research areas are information visualization and visual analytics, with a focus on collaborative work scenarios. She's interested in exploring how people can most effectively work together when analyzing large and complex data sets on novel display technology such as small screen, touch screens, wall displays, or tabletops. And today she's going to explore what novel display technology has done so far to advance research in visualization and visual analytics, and she's going to reflect on how these new technologies allow visualization and visual analytics to progress further. Petra, over to you, and I hope you have a different clicker.
Yes. I need the mic. Yes. Okay. All right, so can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So thanks a lot for the invitation, and I always love coming back to Canada. As you heard, I did my PhD here, I mean in Calgary, but in this country. I was asked to tell you guys a little bit about INRIA, and that's fair enough because I didn't really know what it was before I joined them either. So INRIA is the French National Research Institute for Computer Science, and I was trying to think if there was something similar in Canada or elsewhere in the world, and I don't quite think so. So it's a bit comparable to the Fraunhofer Institute, if you're familiar with that in Germany, but basically what it is it's the National Research Lab for Computer Science and Automation. So there are just under 2,000 permanent researchers split up into 8 different centers basically in 8 different cities, doing both fundamental and applied research in all areas of computer science. And I'm in the research lab that's called INRIA Saclay, which is just a little bit south of Paris. So if you ever stop by in Paris and you want to know more about INRIA, drop me an email and you can come and visit our lab. All right, so with that, I'm going to start my presentation. So as you saw, the title of the talk is, I have to find a good place to stand, maybe here, is about display technology. And I had the word visual analytics in the title, but really what I'm talking about is display. So what is shown on there is visualization. So the visualization is the visual part of visual analytics. So I'm going to use the words interchangeably, just to let you know. If I say visualization, it might as well apply to visual analytics. So let's first have a look at what do we mean by display technology? And probably you're going to think, well, obviously we're talking about screens. But if you look into the past, people have used all sorts of different displays as a medium for showing data visualizations. So this started a long, long time ago, 6th century before Christ, where people put maps on stone, for example. Also, people have used tapestry. This is the family history of a not very famous Nobel person in Germany. There's visualizations of family trees that are put on walls, for example. But of course, paper was a very, very important medium for visualization for a very long time. And then, well, not very long ago, people started doing visualizations on computer screens. And this is, I don't know if you need to turn off the light, if you can see that. But this is basically what it looked like in the beginning.
In the next few minutes, you're going to see some computer-generated displays of data, dynamic graphics, data in motion. We can use a mouse, which rolls down on the table and positions a cursor at the corresponding points on the screen. This particular mouse has 3 buttons, which can be pressed to signal the computer to do something. On this block, we've arranged for the cursor to be surrounded by a diamond. As we roll around on our computer-drawn scatter plot, the car names pop up whenever the diamond covers its points and disappear when the diamond moves on. If we hold down the leftmost mouse button, the labels stay even when the diamond leaves.
So as you can see, we've come quite a bit further since the first graphics were drawn on the screen, but these graphics were quite impoverished to what what the early visualizations looked like. So I wanted to see what happened in the field of visualization when it began. What kind of technology were people using? And I was very surprised. So I picked up the first IEEE visualization, which is the big visualization conference. It started in 1990. And I looked at the papers to try and see what people reported, what kind of screens they were using. So I was surprised to find one mention of this particular screen that already had a 1280 by 1024 resolution and enough hertz that they could provide stereoscopic viewing. So that's not very far from what we're using nowadays. So nowadays, I would say we're in a phase where we're moving from. This is apparently the standard according to some studies that have been done. Most people have 24-inch 1080p displays, and we're now in a phase where we're moving more over to 4K displays. So we're increasing resolution, but really, so this is a very complicated graphic from Wikipedia, but it basically shows where we were in 1990. What was the standard? It was probably 640 by 480 resolution. Nowadays, it's 1080p, and we're moving a little bit further. We've explored different aspect ratio of screens, but really the screen itself hasn't changed that much. So basically, this has an implication on what we assume we're designing for when we're building visual analytics tools. So I would argue that the current assumption that we have is people are working in is a scenario just like this. There's a desktop. There's a person sitting in front of it. There are the standard input devices, mouse, keyboard, and there's one or maybe more screens. Typically, what we design for is one screen. But let's engage in a little thought experiment. What if we assumed the desktop was dead? If we assume people are no longer working on desktops, what does that mean? So would we use different technology? And if we did, what technology would that be? And if people are using different technology, what research questions would we have? Would we basically have exactly the same research questions, or would we have to change how we think about building, designing, and visual analytics tools? So people have engaged in this thought experiment and have come up with a couple of very interesting designs, or mock-ups in this case. So this mock-up is basically about a wristband that can, in mid-air, can display different types of data graphics. This is from a Microsoft Vision of the Future video, where they're proposing that people may work on these glass-type displays where the doctors can consult even during an operation and look at the data that is relevant to the particular patient on the table just behind the doctor. Or data about the patient can be projected in place so that the doctor can actually see exactly in relation to the patient what is hidden behind the invisible barrier of the skull in this case. This is another sort of mixed reality type of vision where we can. It's a bit between physical and virtual data, where you can look at graphs and share them and collaborate. But of course, we can do something very, very simple. So this is may have been a Kickstarter project where people started to embed very, very simple, tiny sort of visual indicators on a bike that showed where one would have to go. But of course, you could imagine handlebars to show even more elaborate types of visualizations that would help you see data about your route or what you have done and so on. So that's visualizations embedded in everyday objects. And Of course, there are lots of different mixed reality types of scenarios that people are looking at. This is a kitchen that is where different types of visualizations are embedded that show all kinds of different things. And Lynn yesterday showed one example where we already have something like that embedded in a kitchen, displays that show how much water you're using or how much energy you're using. If you're interested in what people have thought about the vision for computing will be, there's a very interesting website you can go to called Visions of Computing, where some people are collecting the ideas that people have had about the future of computing. So I've shown you a couple of examples of things that people are envisioning for the future of computing. But if we still assume we're building visual analytics tools for this scenario, how much longer will we be able to shape the future if it is going to look a little bit more like what we see on the right here? So that is a question I'd like to pose, and I think it has to do also with what we want for our visual analytics tools. So there are 4 things I'm proposing that we want. There may be a lot more, but these 4 things are: we want the tools to be useful. So we want them to be useful for a specific user group, or they can be small or large, but we want them to be useful. We want them to be usable, and we want them to be used, because we're not building something that we want to shelf later, and we want them to be seen. So this could be summarized in: we want them to have some sort of impact on a small or a large group of people. And people have, in the visualization community, have gone so far that to say that we want visualization or visual analytics to save the world. This was from a IEEE Viz panel where what is the future of visualization? It was the discussion, or the grand challenges. So yeah, think for yourself if you can go that far, but definitely we want to have impact. So you may have seen this in the past. This is a very standard representation of how we're building visualization, visual analytics tools. We have some data. We select a subset of the data that we want to deal with. We build some representations, presentations, and show it on the screen to some person. Now, if we look at these 4 things on the top that we may want for visual analytics tools, then to be useful, people have spent a lot of effort into working on these things: finding the right type of data, helping people to select the right types of subsets of data, building the right visualizations, and presenting them in a good way. But I would argue that for the last 3, it is in particular very important to think about the kinds of displays that the visualizations are shown on, the person using them, and how one can interact with them. And I would argue, I'm going to show you that there's actually considerably less research being done on this part, even though it's a very important thing for those types of things we want visualizations to do. So let's look at where we're at in sort of the research community. So I would argue that the desktop has always the desktop display has always been fundamental to visualization, visual analytics research as the type of thing we're designing for. And we have visualizations, let them grow with what displays can do, mostly in terms of what kinds of colors they can display and the size of the display as well, and the resolution. But the question is really, have we done much more than just letting our visualizations grow like that? And it turns out, yes, there's lots of people who have done research on all kinds of different spaces, such as large displays, mobile displays, really small displays, even physical visualizations, mixed reality things, or things like caves, for example, immersive environments. And this is good because these kinds of environments are opening up a lot of different opportunities for visualization, visual analytics research. For example, this new environment means that people can share the space and they can work together. That also means that visualization tools can be used in different spaces than they could before, such as meeting rooms, museums, hallways, and so on. It also means that we will be able to we can offer different types of mechanisms for interacting or interfacing with the visualizations. Things like hands or tangible inputs have more degrees of freedom than a mouse. There are even higher pixel counts, so we can display more data. There are different types of projections, such as on a sphere. I'll show you a video of that in a bit. And there are other input modalities, and potentially they can have a positive impact on cognition. There needs to be more research about that, but there are some indications that, for example, using touch is helpful in the ways we think about data. So that means there are opportunities, but there are also, with these opportunities, come new challenges. So research on these kinds of novel spaces is not necessarily always that simple, because we have to rethink how we design interaction, we have to rethink how we design representations, and we have to think about socio-technical aspects, such as when people collaborate and share data and insights. And of course, there are the technological and infrastructure problems, such as how do you deal with displaying data on across a cluster that drives, I don't know, 100 different displays, for example. So I'm going to show you some research problems just to outline what kind of projects people have done to address some of these challenges. So first, technological challenges. So one really, I think, really innovative and inspiring project was done very early in 1994. And this was a visualization that was projected using stereoscopic viewing, and it was multi-user already, and yeah, required glasses and gloves, but it was sort of touch enabled, or at least mid-air interaction. So the application is, of course, a bit sketchy, because I don't know if you may want to move bones around in a body that much, but what you can do here is actually quite inspiring. So you can move your hands, you can grab things in 3D, move them around, and yeah, as you can see in these pictures here on the right, there are several people collaborating already in 1994. And you know, when tabletops came out and were researched much more in-depth, was just relatively recently compared to this time. Here's a project that I think is very interesting. It's called Inform from the MIT Media Lab. And here they're looking at physical 3D bar charts. So they're basically dropping virtual data and then trying to see how you can manipulate and interact with it. And this is one of the projects that really made me think, for example, if you display mathematical formula, does that and how does it help people to actually feel what a formula looks like or what data looks like? And this is a technological problem. As you can see, there's a lot of infrastructure under this display. It doesn't look like much. There are a couple of bars going up and down, but it's a huge setup underneath that needs to be controlled and changed and shaped. Here's a project that is a bit older by now as well, but I think this is really fascinating, because this is really a completely different type of screen. It's round, spherical, and I really wonder what the effect is on cognition if you're just showing people spherical data and how they think about the data. So here they're just starting the demo with just basically what their research contribution was making this touch enabled. They describe a very particular setup on the bottom and how they can track fingers and so on. But one of the demos they have here is, well, quite obviously the geospatial application, or just basically a globe. But you can imagine there to be lots of interesting geospatial data mapped onto it that people can explore by touch on this particular screen setup. Yeah, and in their paper they describe different gestures and so on, how you can interact with this particular sphere. So these were some technological challenges. Now on to some interaction challenges. This is one project where the researchers looked at displaying data on a tabletop and using more than one central display, and also basically modifying and interacting with these what they call lenses here, these different types of lenses where you can, for example, freeze some data, put it next to each other, compare it, lift it up, and move it around. And here the interaction challenges is really how do you combine interaction with interactions on the screen and on these well, different types of lenses. And these are just some examples. For example, here's zoom in, zoom out. Here they are developing sort of a rotation-based gesture on this lens that allows you to actually do a focus and context lens over this data that is displayed here. Yeah, and here's a map-based example where on the lens you can select sort of different regions and then display different parameters, or in this case, move through time, for example. And on the one hand, this was really a technical challenge as well, because they needed a way to project onto the table from the bottom and onto these lenses from the top. But I categorized this as an interaction challenge paper because they actually came up with this really nice design space of different types of interactions that you can do with these lenses, and the different types of physical movements that you can do. And then they thought about how you could map these to meaningful data interactions. And physical visualizations also pose interesting interaction challenges, and physical visualizations have been used for a very long time. So this is one of the visualizations that were used actually to understand the hemoglobin molecule. And the guys who were studying this actually built this to help themselves think about and understand what this molecule was doing. Here's one project that I think is really fascinating is basically a volumetric data set, so from an MRI scan, for example, and you can play with it and slice it in different ways and look at what your brain or somebody else's brain looks like from different viewpoints and angles. And in our lab, we've done, some of our PhD students and permanent researchers have done a lot of research on how people interact with physical charts. So in this case, physical bar charts. And they came up with a tool that actually helps people to 3D print their data. And here, basically, they're walking through how this tool works. So you select some data that you want to visualize. You choose the type of chart that you want, in this case, a bar chart, and you get a sort of a 3D preview. And then a little bit Tableau style, you select the kind of data dimensions that you want to map to different aspects of the 3D visualization. So here you get a preview of what your bar chart will look like, and these are the cuts that you will send to your laser cutter. So then you can choose the material if you want wood or acrylic or something else, and choose the properties of the material, and you can further then get sort of a preview and modify what your 3D model or your 3D visualization will look like. And here's an example. I think this is the data set I created for my first baby's feeding habit. This is somebody else's, I think, SVN commits. And yeah, so here, well, different types of charts. This is a cycling chart and so on. If you're interested in more information about physical visualizations, these guys in my lab that work on them primarily, they have put together this wiki called dataphys.org, and you can see who are the people who are working on it, what kind of problems are they working on, and you can join the community if this is something you're currently working on. Here's another project that I put in because it's this actually from Toronto, or at least from a researcher from Toronto.
Users bring their laptops to the interactive table, connect to a server with a lightweight client, share their screen images on a high-resolution table. Each laptop screen on the table is rendered with a control bar, with buttons that allow users to switch the priority of the image. These images are automatically laid out based on the priority of each display. Users are also free to manually manage the layout of both the table and wall surfaces. Gestural input on the table controls the magnification and placement of the laptop images on both the table and the wall.
Double tapping on a laptop image enters a full screen mode with mouse animation. In this mode, the synchronized view between the table and the wall is severed. User actions on the table are interpreted as mouse input and sent to the device.
So I'm going to stop that here. Basically, the main interaction problem they were working on was to try and support people who wanted to work together on their data, but didn't have a dedicated setup for doing that. So people would be able to just bring their laptops and put on the shared screens the types of things that they wanted to discuss and interact with together. So they came up with the setup of a large display, a tabletop display that was used for coordination, and the different laptops that people just bring and could be connected. There's been more research on this kind of setup recently, but I think this was a very, very nice first start a couple of years ago. And of course, when you think about interaction challenges, in touch in particular, you always have this problem of the resolution of your data is typically kind of mathematically defined or infinite, but you're mapping it to a screen where you're basically already rasterizing it, and then on the top you have some sort of raster that detects your interaction. So you always have this challenge of going through these different levels of interacting with your data. So this is one very fundamental problem that you have to deal with. So now onto some socio-technical challenges, and this is something I've worked a lot on in the past. So what does that mean? Basically, the types of challenges here have to do with trying to understand how people think about data and how they want to work, and then supporting the way that they want to work with technology. But in order to understand how people want to work, researchers have done some studies that involved studying sort of the more or less natural way that people work with other non-technical solutions. So in this case, paper. So here, Anthony Robinson did a very interesting study where they had intelligence analysts look at data and come up with a solution to a particular challenge. And while they were doing this, they had to lay out they naturally did lay out the information that they had on paper on a big table. And then they brought two of these intelligence analysts together, and they had to come up with a joint recommendation or solution from the data that they were looking at. And the researchers looked at how people actually arranged information on this big display in order to build software that, well, potentially could later support these types of arrangement or this way of thinking about data. And similar studies have been done in different spaces. So here's a study from the University of Virginia where they were basically doing the same thing but digitally on a very, very large desktop display. And they looked at how people arrange these different snippets of information on this large display. And actually what they did is they compared people who were allowed to freely arrange them and people who couldn't, and always having people sort of build their own mental map of the data was the most beneficial. Other socio-technical challenges that people have looked at is what happens around a shared space when people are doing data analysis. So note-taking was one of the things that happened very frequently in the study from Melanie Torrey's lab at the University of Victoria. So here they looked at what kinds of notes people take, what they write down, when they write things down, in order to see if this is something that would make sense to put into a digital tool or something that just makes sense to leave off table. And now onto some representational challenges. And these are particularly interesting because you could imagine that we know a lot about visualization already. So why not just make things bigger if there's a bigger display, or smaller if there's a smaller display? So the question really is, what we know about visualization design and the kind of guidelines we already have, the best practices that we know about, do they actually still work if we go to design something like a smartwatch or a really, really big display? And we've done, so this is one of the projects I was involved with. We've done a study where we looked at one very, very low level visualization component, several low-level visual components, and you may be familiar with this graphic here. This was a very interesting study by Cleveland, where they looked at how effective different kinds of visual components were at depicting quantitative data. So they found out if you're using position, for example, as in like a line chart, the up and down distances, that would be a position. People are very accurate at judging quantities. Lengths also work well, the same idea, just with bar charts. Angles and slopes are okay. People are not very good at judging areas, surprisingly, even though they're used a lot. And then volume, color, and density were pretty much not very good. So we used this as a starting point and wanted to see if this kind of order that they were proposing actually still held on a large display. So on a large display, we questioned that this would hold because of the problem of viewpoints. So if you imagine you have a very large wall display and there are two people standing in front of it, one could be very far away, one could be very close, and depending on where the people were in the room, they had completely different viewpoints on the data. And having a different viewpoint kind of distorts how you see the data. So basically, there's a long study behind it, but our results showed that our ordering actually wasn't the same as the Cleveland and McGill study proposed. And in particular, we found that angle was very, very affected by having skewed viewpoints. So if you, for example, if you imagine me looking at some data at the end of the screen, then if this was a pie chart, for example, I wouldn't be able to view this or to judge actually the angle of the pie pieces very well. So having a different kind of encoding would have been better, like a bar chart, for example. And people have done similar asked similar questions, for example, on tabletop displays. What happens when people have to read charts upside down or at a 90-degree angles? And they also found that different charts are affected in different ways. And another interesting representational question that people have posed is what happens in terms of visual scalability. And visual scalability was defined as something where, let's assume you have a certain amount of data on your desktop display, and now you're moving to a display that is 3 times as big. Now, let's assume you're displaying 3 times as much data. Does that mean to analyze and look at this data, you need 3 times as much time, or is there like a different relationship? And what they found was that when they gave people tasks to do on a small display and on a large display, they had an increase in data of 20 times increase in data, but the task completion time was just 3 times as large on the large display. So it seemed that the large display was actually quite good and made people faster at looking at data. But really the question is what happens if you move to even larger displays. So the largest one that I know of right now is the reality deck at Stony Brook University, where they have a really, really big room of displays, and basically from all 4 sides you could look at data. But the question really is how well people can cope with this amount of data and how to best display it so that people can cope with it. So having shown you this, you saw a lot of different projects and questions that people are already looking at, which may give you a little bit of a wrong impression of how much research there is in this field. So let's look a bit more data-driven at how this research fits into the greater research landscape in visualization. So if you're familiar with submitting papers to conferences, in particular the IEEE Viz and Euroviz, Pacific Viz conferences, you may have encountered this kind of screen. So when you're submitting a paper to one of these conferences, you are asked to rate your paper, or give your paper as a keyword from a predefined set. So in these sets of keywords, there's one category called display and interaction technology, and there's things like haptics, immersive displays, large and high-res displays, and stereo displays, and so on. So what we looked at is how many people actually chose this kind of keyword for their paper. So we had data from 2008 to 2013, and there were quite a number of papers in there, and display and interaction technology was among the 3 least selected types of keywords. And interestingly, perception and cognition was even lower, which is kind of sad. But display and interaction technology wasn't a very common keyword, even though everybody's using displays, but dedicated research on it was kind of low. And we also engaged in a research project where we looked at the kinds of keywords that people gave themselves to papers. So we looked at a couple, almost, I think just over 1,000 papers, and collected all the keywords that authors gave, and looked at which kinds of keywords were related to displays. So it turns out that these are all the keywords that are related to displays, and the most common one was tiled displays, multi-projector displays, large and high-res displays. So there has been, I would say, most research on large displays, and a lot less frequently on others. And if we look at the overall number, there were 38 out of the 1,039 papers we looked at that actually had a display-related keyword. So in 10 years of papers, only about 3.6% had dedicated research on displays and, display technology. And these are all the papers. And here you can see that, well, I would say probably there's a little bit more in the recent years, but not that much. Per year, there's about maybe 5 papers. So it's not that much if you look at the overall trend. But so we only looked at the visualization-related conferences, and of course it's possible that people do a lot more research on this topic and send it to other conferences, like the Kai conference, the VR conferences, tabletop conferences, and so on. And we asked ourselves that question too, and we did a little bit of a survey on interactive surfaces and visualization. So we looked at a bunch of different conferences, including not all, but many of these, and looked at what kind of papers related to display technology are published elsewhere. So we found a couple of interesting ones just to show you a bit more of some examples. So here's one that was published at, it doesn't say, so I don't remember. May have been KaiOWist, I think, where they were looking at a dome display. And really the research contribution, it's a little bit hard to see with the lights, but there's a pinching gesture he's doing in front of the projector, and by doing this, he can sort of zoom in and zoom out this dome display. Here's one on flexible displays. This is one on different types of lenses. It does say. So this is Kai, Cybis, and yeah, this was the ITS conference. And here's one that was done in Sheila's lab for visualization on a tablet, so touch interaction with the different kinds of representations. And here's sort of the general data-driven overview. And we found that, in particular, the ITS, it's the conference on interactive tabletops and surfaces, had a relatively high number of papers. So the red bars are the papers, the yellow bars are basically posters, extended abstracts. There are some at Kai and some at other conferences. So there's a pretty wide spread. So there are more people than just, more papers out there than just those in the visualization community. And what we were actually interested in is not only where the papers are going, but what kind of research is being done on displays and what kind of displays people are looking at in particular. So this is now already 2 years old, I think, 2 years old. And back then, most people were really looking at tabletop displays. So there was lots of research on visualization with tabletop displays. But for example, one thing that I find really interesting is that there's very, very, very little on mobile, even though so many people are using mobiles. And we're currently doing a research project where we're looking at what kinds of charts people are using on mobile displays, and the design is lacking, so to say it nicely. In terms of input modalities, most people are looking at touch. So there's most papers looked at touch, really big difference. Not as much on tangibles, pens, and other types of input. The types of focus or main contribution of these papers were mostly on interaction. So That means people were proposing new types of gestures or proposing different types of widgets for interaction, for example. The second most common was application. So people were actually proposing, this is also from Calgary, a work on sort of reservoir engineering to support engineers in doing geospatial analysis. Some on collaboration, not as much. Some on software toolkits and infrastructure, and just some on more technical challenges. In terms of the data that people were using, most was 2D spatial data or multidimensional data. Some people did 3D spatial data, and then more particular data sets like networks and text and others. But yeah, so basically, if your intuition is that you see lots and lots of maps on these types of interactive displays, you're probably right. That's the most common one. So let's go back to this initial question I was posing. So I was asking, have we done much more than letting visualizations grow from desktops such as this to what we have right now? And my answer to that would be, yes, we have, but not a whole lot more. And I think this is something we should think about. In particular, we should think about, how much do we actually care about display technology, and how much should we care about it? How important is it really to us? And if we assume it is important to us, then we need to think as a community of researchers or practitioners working on visualizations, are we actually spending enough time shaping what visualizations on these new displays look like? In particular, for example, the fact that there are so few visualization papers that help people design or implement the right types of visualizations for mobile displays is really a shame. So basically, the question is, are we well prepared when people approach us and say, hey, I want to build a visualization for a mobile display, what should I do? I want to put something on a wall. What should I do? What would be the right way to do? Are we prepared to answer these questions? And do we want to shape the future of where visualizations will be basically in our lives, in our homes, in our workplaces, and so on? And a more fundamental question is particularly important for the people who are in the research community, is to think about whether we consider research on novel displays and interaction as part of visualization research. I'm posing this question in particular because myself, as somebody who has been working in this space, I've often encountered, I don't have the slide anymore, but basically I've often encountered reviews where the reviewers say, well, you're proposing a new interaction technique or a technical solution to a new display, but really you should be sending this to an interaction conference such as Kai, but not to a visualization conference. And to me, this is the wrong thing to do, because really as a community, I think in doing visualization research, we need to help people and we need to have the answers to proposing them how to make, use, and shape visualization spaces in the future. And if this includes an interaction challenge, that's perfectly fine. It is a visualization research contribution in my mind. But I'm very happy to discuss this if you have questions or you want to argue and you don't agree with me. And yeah, so this is the end of my talk. And that's it. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to discuss, especially if you disagree with me.
That was a lovely overview. But I have a question for you, and that is to say, why did you only look at visualization venues for where this research is going. Because there are a number of other, I think what's happened with visualization is what happened with computing, where it used to be the sort of research domain in a nicely contained slice. And now there's computing research being done in bioinformatics that isn't honed in computing departments and not necessarily showing up in computing journals. And I see the same thing with visualization. So what would happen if you cast your net wider?
Yeah, so I think this maybe wasn't entirely clear, but we did two types of research. So the first one was looking at only visualization papers and looking at how much display kind of research is happening there. And it turned out not that much. And then we did another study where we actually looked at other, I mean, not every other conference, but in particular the interaction ones like interactive tabletops and surfaces, Kai, WIST, and so on. And there we looked at how many visualization-related papers were published there. And this is the last, like, with all the different bar charts I showed you. This was from all of these conferences.
Right. I was actually suggesting that you would go further. For example, if you look at large control system types of conferences, human factors is talking about visualization. They're only talking about it lightly, but it seems to be really systems management, cybernetics. Many of those in which visualization is core to what they do. And they're dealing with off desktop, or at least not just desktop, display configurations as part of the process.
Yeah, I completely agree that that would be super fascinating. But I think to make the point, this was probably okay to do because we could show that there's all of this research going on, and I'm sure there's lots more elsewhere, and not at the main visualization conferences, which is, in my opinion, really a pity because so many visualization researchers don't even consider that visualization research, and I think that's absolutely wrong.
I was going to just add a little bit.
Yeah.
So I thought your overview was fantastic, and it's wonderful to have the historical context as well. I think it's very good this conference with a number of presentations of history. But mobile HCI has actually begun to look at visualization. So that started last year, and this year there's more of a focus. But I think where you'll find that discussion really happening is in the design community.
Mm-hmm.
And in the commercial media, cross-platform community, it is an obsession with people. How to think about translating all forms of content, including infographics and visualization onto the small screen. So some of that are at design research conferences for sure, but the other is in the literature that is more about the kind of challenges of design. It's not exactly it's in the commercial research community, I'd say not so much in maybe some other ones. But I think, as you said, it's you have to reach a point where you don't look at everything, and I think looking at the gaps is very important.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I should look at that more. Actually, I think, bringing all of these communities closer together would be really interesting. There, at the Viz conference, there is this arts program, which would be great if there was more of that kind of research being shown there.
I absolutely agree, Sarah, and I think that this is an opportunity. I mean, I was very interested to hear, Petra, that in terms of keywords that visual displays and interaction features so low and cognition features even lower. That's very surprising stat. So maybe there's some cross-fertilization that needs to happen here. And certainly Sarah's point to the design community, design conferences, but also very much so in the commercial world, there's an arms race going on to figure out how to visualize on a small screen, and there's some highly successful examples out there about looking at social data, getting that onto the small screen. That's really important because it's where it's generated from. So we're seeing a lot of that in the fashion world, in areas of design, particularly in the automotive world. That's happening as well. So we should know about what each other are doing a little bit more. And is this data visualization? You asked that really important question. So thank you for asking that. And I agree with you. Yes, it is.
Thanks.
gave something to stick up the Petra. It's going to be a task for them. Petra made a really good point that all of the questions have this, and that it is interactive visualization. So just putting pixels on the screen is necessary but not sufficient to provide the real value of visual analytics. And this goes towards any form of analytics, whether it be 3D, 2D, and that's really where this is. So I'd suggest as research topics for those of our students in the room, that understanding how to effectively interact with really large data sources, independent of the size of the display, is a very difficult job. Gestures are not going to cut because our fingers are too fat. And in fact, vocabulary is not even established yet for gesture setting direction. A lot of work to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's actually lots of interesting research space also in combining interaction with cognition, because lots of people have this intuition, for example, with touch, that it helps somehow, but nobody, it's very hard to quantify it, say, okay, I don't know, you get better memory, or you get better insights, or you get better understandings, or something like that. That is, I haven't seen a very conclusive study on that, and I'm not sure it's possible, but it's definitely something that would be nice to have.
I appreciate my PhD candidate at UIT. Wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed the look into the future of displays. But one thing that I do see that's common nowadays, at least in the last couple of years, is this new push into this personal display space. So, Google Glass may be one example. Instead of having these large displays that you can work on and others see what you're doing, there's also an incentive to have a personal space where you are kind of in your own environment, in your own display space, just so to say, working on a more private, I guess, work. So in your study, in your research, have you seen the future, the progress of these like personal displays, and also where they may be going in tandem with displays?
So one of the things that people are looking at a lot is currently, I would say, is the multi-display spaces, where you have large displays and small displays. There isn't that much dedicated on purely mobile or small displays. Tablets have been done a little bit, but mobile really not that much, even though I think there's so much even fundamental research that still has to be done in terms of perception, for example. We don't know, let's assume, like, I had a smartwatch and I had a bar chart on it. What happens if I do, how long do I need to look before I understand the data, or how tilted can my watch be before I make a mistake, or what happens if there's sunshine falling on my watch? Can I still, like, figuring out what is the role of the, like, color changes, for example, when you are, like, in the shade or in the sun or in the water? I don't know. There's lots of fundamental research, perceptual research questions, for example, to be answered for these small devices that I haven't really seen research on. And this would be just like perceptual. Then, of course, in terms of how much do you need to aggregate the data, how can you interact when your space is really that small? You can do 1, 2, 3, 4 PhDs on that if you want.
We have time for one more question, and that's it. Does anybody? If not, okay. Excellent. So thank you both. Joy Henderson with City, software startup, and we're starting to look at data visualization on the possibility of doing it on something like a credit card. That's a bit crazy, but have you seen that?
I haven't, but I think it's fabulous. It's a really cool. But would this be printed or like a display?
Display.
Okay, so changing, yeah. That's so what I really love are these kinds of ideas where visualizations are embedded into everyday objects. Mm-hmm. Like the bike idea, for example, that I showed briefly, it's so impoverished with just 3 LEDs on this in the side, but there could be so many interesting things in the handlebars, or like a credit card, or I find that super interesting. I hope people will do lots more on that.
Thank you very much, Petra.
Mm-hmm.
Well done. Thank you.